For 40 years, Georg Gaertner had been hiding in plain sight, but finally the last German prisoner of war in America was ready to surrender. No one, not even his wife, knew who he really was. His story reveals what happened to hundreds of thousands like him. It all began in 1943 as a simple wartime operation. The flood of German prisoners began in 1943 when Allied victories in North Africa and Sicily delivered thousands of captured Wehrmacht soldiers into American custody. The numbers grew rapidly. By 1945, approximately 371,000 German POWs were held on American soil, one of the largest populations of enemy soldiers ever detained in American territory. The War Department scattered them everywhere, from Colorado's Rocky Mountains to Arizona's deserts. More than 700 camps housed German prisoners across 46 states. Camp Carson, Fort Robinson, and Camp Papago Park became the largest installations. Only 3 states, Nevada, North Dakota, and Vermont, remained untouched. Most camps were hastily converted military bases or newly constructed compounds in remote areas. Each camp typically housed between 500 and 3,000 prisoners, surrounded by double rows of barbed wire and guard towers. Long wooden barracks, mess halls, and recreational buildings were arranged in orderly rows that reflected American military efficiency. Treatment followed Geneva Convention requirements, ensuring prisoners received adequate food, medical care, and housing. American officials took the conventions seriously, partly from genuine humanitarian concern and partly from fear that mistreating German POWs would trigger reprisals against Allied prisoners held by Germany. Prisoners received the same food rations as American soldiers, a diet far better than what most German civilians were eating by 1944. Work remained optional but encouraged. For those who chose to work, 80 cents per day and canteen coupons provided access to small luxuries: cigarettes, candy, beer, and other comforts from home. The canteens stocked American products alongside German imports when available, creating an odd marketplace where former enemies browsed with Deutschmarks printed on camp script. Many POWs found work on farms, in canneries, and logging operations, labor that filled critical shortages while American men fought overseas. From California orchards to Maine potato fields, German prisoners harvested crops. They built roads in Texas, processed food in Ohio factories, and worked in lumber mills across the Pacific Northwest. Some became so valuable that farmers lobbied to keep specific prisoners after the war ended. Cultural life flourished behind the wire. Prisoners organized theatrical productions, formed orchestras, and published camp newspapers in German. The most ambitious camps offered university-level courses taught by fellow prisoners who had been professors in civilian life. America called it the Barbed-Wire College. Prisoners could earn credits later recognized by German universities. Despite generally good conditions, some prisoners still attempted to escape. Arizona's Camp Papago Park recorded 25 attempts, more than any other facility. Most escapees were recaptured within days, often turning themselves in when they discovered how vast and empty the American landscape actually was. But one man would disappear for 40 years. Beneath the surface of camp routine, hardcore Nazi prisoners maintained their own system of justice. Self-appointed honor courts investigated fellow Germans suspected of collaboration with American authorities. The punishment for betraying the Reich was death, and the courts had willing executioners to carry out their sentences. On November 4, 1943, Johannes Kuntz was beaten to death in Camp Tonkawa, Oklahoma. The 39-year-old Afrika Korps veteran had been passing notes to the camp doctor during sick call, providing information about his fellow prisoners. 200 German POWs participated in what they called a trial. 5 men carried out the execution. Kuntz's bloodied uniform was found the next morning, and investigators quickly identified the perpetrators. At Camp Aiken, South Carolina, Horst Gunther met the same fate on April 6, 1944. The 23-year-old locksmith was strangled by 2 fellow prisoners who hung his body from a tree to make it appear as though he had taken his own life. American authorities were not fooled. Erich Gauss and Rudolf Straub were arrested within days. The most notorious case occurred at Camp Papago Park, Arizona on March 12, 1944. Werner Drexler, a U-boat veteran who had been cooperating with American interrogators, was beaten and hanged by 7 fellow submariners. His body was discovered the following morning. All 7 perpetrators were identified through their own confessions and testimony from other prisoners who had witnessed the attack. The trials began immediately, but the executions were delayed. President Franklin Roosevelt and military commanders feared that executing German POWs would trigger reprisals against Allied prisoners held in Germany. The condemned men waited in military prisons as the war continued around them. Future Watergate Special Prosecutor Leon Jaworski handled several of the prosecutions, securing convictions in every case. Meanwhile, escape attempts reminded officials not all prisoners had accepted their fate. On December 23, 1944, 25 German naval officers tunneled 178 feet out of Camp Papago Park's officers' compound. They had spent months digging through the hard desert soil, hiding the excavated dirt under a volleyball court. The breakout went undetected for hours, but the Arizona desert proved as effective as any guard. All 25 escapees were recaptured within 3 weeks, most turning themselves in after discovering the Salt and Gila rivers were dry. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. Within weeks, the delayed executions resumed. Between July and August, 14 German prisoners were executed at Fort Leavenworth, 5 for Johannes Kunz's death, 2 for killing Horst Gunther, and 7 submariners for Werner Drexler's murder. It was the largest execution in United States history during the 20th century. Their bodies were buried in the military prison cemetery. The Reich had fallen 3 months earlier, but for hundreds of thousands of German prisoners in America, the war was not over. Repatriation proved far more complex than capture. Americans expected to return prisoners quickly after Germany's surrender, but Allied politics intervened. Wartime agreements had already allocated these men as labor resources for war-damaged nations that demanded compensation for years of occupation and destruction. The process began in February 1946 when the first ships departed East Coast ports. Prisoners believed they were finally going home to Germany. Many had written letters to families they had not contacted in years, expecting joyful reunions in bomb-damaged but familiar towns. Instead, most discovered they were pawns in a larger geopolitical game. The first wave involved 130,000 German POWs designated as British-owned, men who sailed across the Atlantic to camps in Britain. These allocations dated back to 1943 agreements when Britain had agreed to house German prisoners captured in American operations. But the majority faced a different fate. Nearly 740,000 were transferred to French control and redesignated as disarmed enemy forces, a classification that stripped away Geneva Convention protections. France demanded the largest share of German labor. The French government calculated that Germany owed 4 million man-years of work to compensate for French workers forcibly sent to German factories during the occupation. French officials were uninterested in quick repatriation. They wanted reconstruction workers who would stay until the job was finished. In Britain, German prisoners performed agricultural labor and infrastructure repair until late 1947, with conditions generally matching American standards. British families often developed personal relationships with German workers billeted on their farms. Some prisoners learned English, attended local churches, and were invited to family dinners. France offered a harsher reality. German prisoners arrived at camps that lacked adequate shelter, medical care, or winter clothing. They rebuilt destroyed railways, cleared minefields without proper equipment, and reconstructed bombed cities under minimal supervision and maximum danger. Mortality rates varied dramatically by location and assignment. The last German POWs remained in French custody until 1948, with some not released until 1949. By then, many had spent 4 years in captivity, longer than America's entire participation in the war. When they finally reached Germany, they found a divided country they barely recognized. The Soviet Union took a different approach entirely. Moscow held German prisoners until 1956, using them for reconstruction work in territories devastated by the German invasion. The final prisoner train from Soviet captivity arrived in West Germany 11 years after the war ended. Of the 371,000 German prisoners held in America, 477 died in captivity from illness, accidents, and violence. They were buried in military cemeteries from Fort Bliss, Texas to Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. Most graves remain unmarked. No German families ever traveled to claim their bodies. But thousands of others chose to return to America after the war ended. Approximately 5,000 former German POWs emigrated to the United States in the post-war years, drawn back by memories of their wartime treatment and opportunities unavailable in devastated Germany. Some married American women they had met during captivity. Others simply preferred American life to the reconstruction struggles at home. The most remarkable post-war story belonged to Georg Gaertner. On September 21, 1945, 4 months after Germany's surrender, the 24-year-old former Afrika Korps sergeant crawled under the barbed wire at Camp Deming, New Mexico, and hopped a freight train heading west. His hometown of Schweidnitz in Lower Silesia had fallen under Soviet occupation. Rather than face repatriation to communist rule, he chose to disappear in America. For 40 years, Gaertner lived as Dennis F. Wiles. He worked as a migrant laborer, dishwasher, and construction worker before settling into careers as a ski instructor and tennis pro in California and Colorado. He organized celebrity tennis tournaments, mingling with Hollywood stars who never suspected his background. The FBI searched for him periodically but never came close. He lived quietly, moved frequently, and avoided anything that might require documentation of his past. In 1963, he married Jean Clark, an American woman who knew nothing of his true identity. For 21 years, she lived with a husband who refused to discuss his background, could not travel abroad, and became agitated whenever she pressed him about his mysterious past. In 1984, she packed her bags and called a taxi, threatening to leave unless he finally told her the truth. That night, Gaertner confessed everything. With his wife's encouragement, he contacted historian Arnold Krammer at Texas A&M University in September 1985. On September 11, 1985, exactly 40 years after his escape, he surrendered to federal authorities in San Pedro, California. The FBI announced it had no further interest in him. Immigration officials confirmed he would not be deported. He was invited to become an American citizen. Gaertner co-authored his autobiography with Krammer and appeared on television talk shows as a curiosity from another era. In November 2009, at age 89, he was finally naturalized as a United States citizen. He died on January 30, 2013 in Colorado, having outlived the Reich by nearly 70 years. Veterans of American POW camps continued returning to visit the small towns where they had spent the war, often bringing their families to see where their American experience began. The camps themselves were long gone, replaced by housing developments and shopping centers. But the men who had lived behind the wire never forgot the country that had treated them, even as enemies, with unexpected dignity. Thanks for watching. If you found this video insightful, watch What Happened to the Waffen-SS After World War II next. Like this video, subscribe, and hit the bell for more history inside, and we will see you in the next one.